Charlie's background is in strategic marketing and communications, and he founded the agency Gusto in 2014. More recently, he founded the Anti-Greenwash Charter, which is a not-for-profit initiative that helps organizations build trust through honest, credible sustainability communication, and TrueMark, an independent verification service for sustainability reports. And he also hosts the Responsible Edge podcast, which I highly recommend. So we wanted to dive into how we can build trust through radical transparency with Charlie today. And start off by asking, what was the turning point for moving away from the agency world and creating this new initiative, which is quite ambitious and exciting?
Anna, thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me along today. And hello, everybody. I recognize some of you. I think some of us are connected via LinkedIn, but perhaps this might be the first time that we've actually sort of met online or in person, if you like. But it's a real thrill to be in the room with some like-minded marketeers and communication professionals and to be talking to you guys today. So thank you very much for having me along. So Anna, coming back to your question on kind of my kind of pivot point, I hope this sort of rings true to most of you guys in the room. But for me, it was the kind of 10-year mark of working in marketing when I found myself in my kind of relatively early 30s, I think, thinking to myself, well, I've managed to sell a bit of insulation throughout my career. We predominantly worked in the built environment and construction sectors. We sold a few widgets. There's a few buildings around that perhaps have been, built as a result of some of the work that we've been doing. But what's the real impact of what I've spent my time doing? And it was a little bit of a crisis of what's next and what am I doing with my career that kind of led me to be really fascinated by the creation and publication of the CMA's Green Claims Code back in 2021. I should say at this point that we had two very proactive clients at the time who basically came to us with the CMA's Green Claims Code, and I think gave us a really interesting brief. And I'd love to hear the thoughts of you guys when we get into questions around this. But the brief essentially was, guys, we know that we are responsible in our approach to our marketing and communications, but the brief for you guys as our agency is to come up with some sort of campaign that we can run in order to reassure all of our stakeholders, both internally and externally, that we are a responsible communicator. And I just thought that was an amazing brief. And I kind of got a bit obsessed with it, in all honesty, and thought, this is something I really want to sort of focus my attention on. And that really was the beginning of what then became the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Because from that campaign that we ran with those two clients, we then realized that there was an opportunity to do something to support other organizations that were equally trying to do something to reassure all stakeholders that they were practicing their marketing and comms responsibly.
Well, and we'll get into more of the nuts and bolts of the charter itself shortly. But I wanted to ask, looking back, is there anything from your agency experience that particularly really helped you in creating a new nonprofit and trying to get that to take off? It's a challenging space to be in.
And I think you described it brilliantly at the beginning. I'm going to pinch it with your notion of the ambitiousness of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. It's certainly an ambitious thing that we're sort of attempting to do. I think there's a lot of, in all honesty, when you're starting something new, as I'm sure lots of people in the room are abundantly clear on, it's that resilience and commitment to, the North Star, I guess, of what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to do, and the fact that we think it's a good fight and a fight that's worth fighting. And as we're a few years in now, we're seeing the kind of green shoots, I think, of, this standard being adopted, the organizations that we work with, going through fundamental change in the way that they approach their marketing and communications. And that was really the goal at the heart of this. I thought, in 10 years' time, when I'm looking back and having my crisis moment, wouldn't it be lovely to think, well, actually, I haven't sold so much insulation the last decade. What I've done is helped a few organizations think differently about the way that they communicate. And I think, and I know this isn't your question, I've gone off on a massive tangent here, but just on this point of why I think it's so important, we're facing a collective crisis of confidence and trust in everything that we engage with from a comms and marketing perspective. Well, from a content point of view, look at the rise of fake news and of all the connotations associated with that. From my point of view, doing something to try and rebuild trust in what we're reading and what we're engaging with and the messages that we're hearing is really important, because what that then leads to is speed of decision, which is what we need in order to address some of the fundamental issues at play. But I think that's the core and the reason why we're doing what we do.
Look at you, you probably get people coming to you who are not the worst offenders. If they think that they want to wipe out greenwash by joining the Anti-Greenwash Charter, then they're likely already working quite hard in this space.
Has Exxon not signed up yet?
So, but it'd still be good to see what kind of greenwash you come across, whether it's with people who are really trying hard to wipe it out, or with the worst offenders that you've come across, and what we can all be looking out for.
It's a great question, Anna, and Paul, a very poignantly made point around who's applied to join. We, in all honesty, I won't name names, but we have had some very interesting organizations sort of apply to join the charter. And if we didn't have our fairly robust, transparent and robust assessment process, then we could find ourselves being a greenwashing tool ourselves, which would obviously be a little bit of a shooting ourselves in the foot. So it's just as well, though. But we do have had some interesting organizations that have attempted to essentially greenwash by joining the Anti-Greenwash Charter. I think, come back to your question about like the types of greenwashing that are at play and the ones that are most prevalent. I think there's been like phases, if you like, of greenwashing, and we're into the first sort of phase of greenwashing. I think was very much sort of created as a result of a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness from typically marketing, comms, and salespeople, really, around what it is that they were actually saying and what it was that they were disclosing. So I think there was just a real lack of technical understanding, which led to mistakes, essentially, in the way that data was presented and the way that statements were made. I think with the regulatory tightening that we've seen in terms of the use of language and in terms of the requirement for substantiation of claims, etc., pretty much sort of pioneered, if you like, by some of the work that's been done in the EU with the Green Claims Directive, although that's, as some of you might know, slightly on the rocks. But essentially, standards have been improving from a regulatory point of view. And what that's led to, I think, is a much more, to me, concerning form of greenwashing that we're now looking to address, which is essentially omission-based greenwashing. So, you can create a piece of content that's, all the language is in line with relevant regulation. All of the claims that you've made are fully substantiated with verified third-party evidence. However, it's not what you've said, it's what you've not said in that communication that is the key. And I think you guys are nodding away. I think we can all think of many examples of organizations that look whiter than white in terms of what you're engaging with. But when you dig a little under the surface, you realize that actually the bigger story really hasn't been presented. And that is what, and I know you mentioned at the beginning, Anna, TrueMark. That's sort of what we're trying to address with TrueMark. We're trying to produce a kind of an independent analysis of the context within which comms has been presented. And in that way, we might actually be able to mop up some of that omission-based greenwashing as well.
Yeah, so that's probably a good point to get into what it is that you do at the Charter. What do you ask of signatories?
Sure. So really good question, Anna. So I mentioned back in 2021, the CMA's Green Claims Code was kind of the starting point for this. We kind of sat back with that brief of like, how do you go about essentially reassuring everybody that you're a responsible communicator? And we came up with 3 things that we thought every organization should do in order to essentially be able to position themselves as that. The first one aligns almost directly with what I was just mentioning there around sort of technical expertise and understanding relating to sustainability communications, and that is training. So we conduct essentially greenwash awareness training with organizations where they're upskilled essentially in being aware of the issues and the pitfalls and the techniques, etc., for ensuring that they don't fall into sort of unintentional greenwashing. The second thing that we do, and we require organizations to do, is to do what we call a static or evergreen content review. And that's where you take like your website, your brochure materials, anything that remains fairly static. And essentially that gets reviewed against relevant regulation. So you're looking for, updates to the use of language, phraseology, imagery, those sorts of things that need to be tweaked in order for your static content to align. The final thing that we require all organizations to do during what we call our signatory development phase, so this is before they're recognized as a signatory of the Charter, is that we co-create with the signatories what we call a green claims policy. And this was the core and fundamental part of the work that we did with those clients back in 2021, because the idea that we came up with was, guys, if you want to reassure all your stakeholders that you're a responsible communicator, you need to proactively disclose exactly how you manage your marketing and comms function. You need to be, ruthlessly transparent about your approach to your editorial process, how you go about choosing imagery that goes with particular campaigns, how you train your staff, as I alluded to before. What's your escalation procedure? How does somebody actually get in touch if they've got something that they read that they think, I'm not quite sure what's going on here? Can I speak to somebody within the organization? So the green claims policy for us is all about governance of content that's produced ongoing. So by the time an organization is recognized as a signatory, having completed those three tasks, their teams are greenwash aware. The static content is aligned with relevant regulation, and they have a policy that's publicly available that will essentially create the guardrails for any content that they then produce ongoing. And for us, that then looks like sustainability comms best practice.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive plan that you're basically helping them to create and sort of holding them to account on at the same time.
That's exactly right. From our point of view, this is all about structure and governance. It's about going, okay, there's this big scary thing out there called greenwashing, and reputationally it's incredibly damaging, and even financially it can be incredibly damaging with the rise in the fines that we're seeing. What can I do to enable myself to still talk confidently about my sustainability story? Well, in our opinion, the way that you do it is you get some really clear governance and procedure in place, and then you proactively disclose where, for example, you as an organization are not as sustainable as you might be. And that then addresses that omission-based greenwashing that we alluded to before.
I have a couple of questions that occur to me specifically on the nature of, a true mark, because I suppose a true mark is also a trust mark. I remember, maybe I'll do both questions at one go and then you can pick and choose at will. But one problem that was identified, or a challenge that was identified when I was working on other approaches to sustainability certification years ago now, was that there was already such a proliferation of labels. So this particular context was a food context, and you had, what's the difference between a local banana, an organic banana, a fair trade banana, a Rainforest Alliance banana, and we called the problem the Tower of Label. And so one question is, what kind of response have you had to the notion of specifically certifying communications as being a sort of sufficient category as opposed to the whole of a business? And the second question relating to this, and the challenge of all certification programs is the sort of potential conflict or the relationship between the fact that on the one hand you're trying to push a group to be better and to certify rigidly that they are better, and on the other hand that's the group that you depend on usually financially, whether it's fair trade, organic certification. Even universities, in a sense, they have an interest in primarily selecting candidates who might well pass their degree, because if all of them failed they would struggle to attract more students. So how did you have the confidence that this was enough of a category to warrant certification? And then how do you manage that process of charging the people that you are also pushing to do a better job?
Paul, brilliant questions. I will do my very best to address both of them, but you position them so beautifully and eloquently that I hope I don't miss anything as I run through. So the first question around kind of comms and whether or not it warrants a a mark, as you've alluded to. I think one of the things that's been really noticeable for us has been the number of B Corps that we're now working with. And again, I'm telling you all, I appreciate probably things you already know, but obviously B Corps had a bit of a battering really over the course of the last year or so regarding kind of greenwashing accusations, and obviously some of the organizations that have been able to realize their standard, which kind of touches on, I think, your second point, Paul, which I'll come back to. But the feedback that we're getting is, guys, we are B Corp. Our competitors who also sit within our market, obviously, are a B Corp. We know that they can't substantiate their claims, and we know that they're not implementing marketing and comms best practice to the standards that we are. So we want to almost have that kind of B Corp plus, which is to be both a B Corp and a signatory of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. So I think from our point of view, because there really isn't another standard that specifically looks at the quality of your marketing communications, we think that's reason why it is such an opportunity to do something to address specifically the issue around trust in the communications that organizations are producing. But it's a fascinating comment that you made that, like, what's the role of another standard? I think if there were other standards that were looking within this particular lane, I think I'd feel like hesitant about adding another one to the mix, regardless of whether or not there was nuance or difference. I think what we're doing, though, seems to be fairly unique to us. Just touching on TrueMark as well, I think just for anybody that's thinking, like, hold on a minute, what's this Anti-Greenwash Charter thing? And then there's this TrueMark thing. The feedback that we had in the first couple of years of doing our work was that people were like, this is great, but your campaign reviews that you conduct in order to make sure that we're doing what we said we were doing in our green claims policies, they're retrospective and reactive. So we're essentially checking on their content sort of periodically throughout a 12-month license period. The big bit of feedback was, can you not do something proactive and preventative to stop us from producing greenwashing content in the first place? And that has led us down the very interesting path of essentially producing what is currently a prototype, but essentially it's an AI-powered editorial assistant for your sustainability communications. People that have played with it have, said it's essentially a Grammarly for sustainability comms. It'll allow you to check everything, make sure it's aligned with regulation, your own ESG data, etc., before you then publish that content. So that's just to give you some clarity on that. Paul, I've rambled on quite a bit, so I'm probably forgetting your second question clearly enough. But in terms of that whole, I think it was that question around the sort of slight uneasiness, if you like, of growing an initiative like ours versus upholding the standards and the rigor with which we do what we do. For us, this is why the transparency of the way that our standard works is absolutely crucial. So a couple of things that we make sure that we do. Every campaign review that we produce of our signatories is made publicly available via an appendix within their green claims policy. So and we require our signatories to publish those as a matter of course, regardless of what the judgment is. So ultimately for us, you can see our thinking, our analysis relating to a signatory status and whether or not they can retain it on the public record. It's this degree of kind of radical transparency, if you like, that we know we need to implement in order to ensure the integrity of what we're doing. And those questions are sort of dealt with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that leads on perfectly. I was going to ask you about radical transparency next. You do talk about it in terms of an important way of building trust. And you've given just a great example of how you do that as the charter and the businesses that you work with. Are there examples you can give of companies or campaigns where you think they've really gotten it right in terms of showing progress, but also showing that they're not perfect?
I love this question. And I think actually it was Marlin, who's also on this call, that made me aware of this. So I'm going to props to Marlin for this example. But has anyone come across the glasses brand Ace and Tate? Any nods? Caroline's nodding. Yeah, Nicole's nodding. Their campaign, which actually was back in 2021 now, which seems like a crazy amount of time ago. But they, I don't know, it's 123, so I don't know whether or not I am allowed to swear. So I'll try and keep it.
Always.
Am I allowed to swear? Is it okay? Okay, so their campaign was "We fucked up," and it was, in my mind, genius. It was brilliant. The way it was positioned, the language that they used, and essentially what they did is they just went through and held their hands up clearly, transparently, and completely around the areas of their business that they were not sustainable and mistakes that they had made in terms of suppliers that they had worked with who ultimately turned out to not be the best supplier. And they just aired essentially a great deal of their dirty laundry in essence. But the way that they, coming back to your question specifically, Anna, around why did it work so well? Well, they aired it and they aired it in obviously quite a frank and open way, but ultimately they provided some real clarity, sort of metric, KPI driven clarity around what they were going to do to address those issues. And to me, it was a masterclass in how modern organizations should think about their sustainability communications. And essentially, it's what we now adopt in our green claims policies. So every signatory of the charter, the first section of their green claims policy, before you get into anything else, is literally where we can improve. We haven't gone for it's the "we fucked up" section. That might be that'll be for another iteration. But for now, it's where we can improve. And we require our signatories to detail in detail where they're not sustainable as an organization and what they are trying to do to address those issues. I think that's the core of getting this stuff right.
Where do you see customer expectations changing? This can be in consumer marketing, but also in the B2B space. What do you think is going to be demanded of businesses in terms of sustainability and communications around it?
I was on a call actually yesterday with somebody, and they spoke about this far better than I. But I think what's fascinating is obviously you guys will be aware of the sort of notion of greenhushing and the fact that we're going through a complete reversal from the days of sort of blatant greenwashing being the most sort of prevalent activity to greenhushing, which is essentially we're going to shut up shop and not talk about the sort of the work that we're doing. I think that the point that was made yesterday in the conversation was that it is clear that sustainability, and I'll take it in kind of a B2C context, it is not the primary driver of purchasing and decision making for the vast majority of customers. And coupled with that kind of regulatory reputational concern, it's really evident or really understandable as to why greenhushing has become such a kind of a prevalent theme within marketing and comms. But I think that, and this is one of the things that we're talking to more and more organizations about, it's for us, it's less about looking at whether or not your sustainability communications are well regarded, are rigorous, etc. And it's far more about trying to present yourself as a responsible corporate communicator and just happening to use sustainability and being anti-greenwash in order to address that. Because the one thing that customers across the board are seeking for is a reason to trust in the organizations that they're engaging with. And so when we talk to our prospective signatories, and in fact, we were speaking to one organization who have done some brilliant work over the last 2.5 years and are now just ready to sign the charter. They said to us, 2.5 years ago, we had a board meeting and we identified corporate misinformation and distrust as a key kind of weakness and potential problem for the organization. And we've worked really hard over the last 2.5 years to make sure that we can present ourselves as a very responsible corporate communicator. And that's why we want to sign the Anti-Greenwash Charter, because it's in a way for us to be able to represent that. So yes, customer expectations might be changing in terms of how important sustainability is. But I think what is apparent is that the role of trust and whether or not I can believe in what I'm engaging with, regardless of whether or not it's sustainability comms or not, I think that's really prevalent and that's likely to continue to be the issue moving forward.
Yeah, I actually saw an article this morning. I haven't had a chance to fully read it, but it was John Kerry in the US saying ESG needs a rebrand. It should be efficiency, stability, and growth, I think he was saying, which I think is interesting because we are seeing, people recognize that it's no longer a moral issue. They're doing it for business reasons. So why not just be clear about that and make progress in that way?
Yeah.
Here, here, Anna. Here, here.
But a question that's on my mind, this is not an easy question to answer, really. But the Industrial Revolution, it created prosperity, but it had the shadow side, the hidden side of carbon emissions that have given us the climate emergency. And if we went back in time, we would discourage dependency on fossil fuels. Now, building on this notion of why today's environment is so lacking in trust, the digital revolution and now the AI revolution is creating an environment that all sorts of connectivity and opportunities, just as the Industrial Revolution boosted prosperity. But it is also making disinformation and misinformation and polarization quicker, cheaper, and easier than their opposites. And so you end up with populist politicians. You end up with literally the number of countries in the world that qualify as a democracy going down rather than up. Norms and standards generally going down rather than up. So it's like a downwards escalator. Partly you're remedying that by something that is about trusted communication in the round, not just environmental issues. But, could there come a time when you would discourage businesses from, and this is very relevant for the marketing community, from a dependence on big tech, for example? The front page of the FT not long ago saying, "Is Silicon Valley our foe?" Because of the extent of how technology is increasing our vulnerabilities. This is not an easy one to answer, and for the group, this was not suggested in advance. It's a question for anyone to tackle, not just Charlie. But those are a set of thoughts that occur to us at this point.
Paul, a brilliant set of thoughts. I mean, I'm tempted to give up and go home on the basis of what you presented there, but no, we'll stick around. It's a fascinating set of observations. I think in my mind, and just not to quite deal with the latter of your comment there, but the middle sort of section where you were sort of suggesting that yes, these tools that we now have access to are facilitating, or the catalyst, if you like, for this scenario that we find ourselves in, where there is this huge amount of distrust in what we're engaging with. I think that's for us where TrueMark, that's our hope, or our intention really, is to see whether or not ultimately it's us or not. Hopefully it is, but perhaps it's another. I think we do need collectively to come up with a mark of editorial excellence. And that really is what TrueMark is, in essence, trying to do, trying to create something that when you see that appended to an advert, or you see it appended to, a blog post or a social media post or whatever, and you can see that mark, you immediately know, I know that piece of content has gone through an editorial process which I can trust in. And if I want to engage and understand more about the specifics of the analysis that was done on this particular piece of content, I can click on that mark and I can go through, in our case, to what we call a transparency report, which essentially details an additional layer of essentially analysis that was done on that particular piece of content on behalf of the reader, on behalf of the customer, around what's the context within which this content's being produced, how is the language aligned with relevant regulation, and are the claims that are made fully substantiated. So for me, that is what the current circumstances of the world requires. And it's unfortunate that it does, but we are where we are. And what we're hoping is that mark becomes the sort of thing that essentially becomes almost a bit of a license to operate, or a license to communicate, whereby organizations go, do you know what? Our competitors, sorry, are all utilizing this mark in order to essentially prove the quality of their comms. We need to be getting on board as well. And if we can create that groundswell of support and adoption, then we can improve standards. And if we can improve standards, then coming back to my original point at the beginning, we might all be able to make decisions a little quicker, which will ultimately be very helpful.
And I mentioned earlier, the Responsible Edge podcast is definitely one people should listen to. And obviously we can refer businesses to you. How can we all better support the growth of the Charter?
That's a really good question, Anna. Well, first of all, you've all supported the growth of the Charter in just being here today and asking the kind of questions that you have. As Karen alluded to, we've got our next council meeting tomorrow, and I'll definitely be taking along some of these questions for reflection there. So first of all, you've all helped in that way. So thank you very much. I think there's something really, really kind of core and fundamental to what we're doing that we actually had a chance to speak at a round table with the Department for Business and Trade recently, whereby essentially it was the Responsible Business Conduct Review for the UK's trade strategy. And I think we were there because we were the comms people and there's no one else that's necessarily doing something in this space, as Paul alluded to. But it was great to be there nonetheless. And we got a chance to pitch, like, what would we like to see happen? And our idea is that regardless of whether or not you're a signatory of the Anti-Greenwash Charter, I mean, obviously we hope that organizations would choose to become one or not. We think the adoption of a green claims policy as a foundational, fundamental document to enable an organization to communicate about sustainability, we think that's best practice, regardless of whether or not you have somebody verify that you're implementing it or not. So what we're doing is trying to encourage the sort of the wider uptake of producing one. We have a green claims policy template that's available on our website. It very much talks you through, I guess, the process of putting one together. And as I'm speaking to a group of marketeers and comms people, it would be fascinating to firstly get your view on that template and whether or not you think there's anything like glaringly missing from it. And secondly, if you like it, to put it in front of, clients, colleagues, etc., for them to think about adopting one themselves.
Yeah, it's
We can
that.
share that around
Yeah, I'll
around the
definitely
group.
include that in the follow-up to this, and when we share the recording of this on our website and social channels. And it, it it feels like that's a really accessible first step that people can take. Anyone can do. I mean, it requires some time and effort, but it's a way to move forwards in a clear way that means they can then consider becoming a member of the charter as well.
And just to pick up on that point as well, I think what's really interesting, we've had people that have said, look, there's things in there that we just have not thought about. There are things there that we as a small organization with a small marketing team, like we just kind of do this stuff without really thinking about it. But now we've had a chance to go through and actually now we have some really clear, ideas about how we approach these things, and therefore our communication standards have improved. So if that's what comes of this, that it's a bit of a mirror to hold up to how you're currently operating, we're really happy that that's the impact it can have.
Yeah, and even if people are incredibly sustainable in their communication, going through it might give them new ideas and new ways of thinking of things, which of course is useful for anyone. So we'll definitely share that and promote it, and really appreciate you bringing that to our attention, and for all of the work that you're doing, and for sharing it all with us today.